We're kicking off NFL Week 2 here with 5 must-start running backs for fantasy football lineups here. We've got a great slate of games. We've got some really interesting team situations and obviously more information on the table for us to break down and assess here for this week's games after being able to kind of digest those Week 1 performances. So make sure to stick around for all that and more. Click that subscribe button if you're new around here. We're posting multiple podcast-style episodes every single day of the week, the entire fantasy football season, and getting you guys everything you need to dominate and crush your leagues this year. Go check out some other videos we've got up on the channel after you watch this one. We've got a huge Week 2 playlist already starting to be built here. We uploaded 8 episodes yesterday, so go check all that stuff out. And without further ado, I won't waste too much more time. Let's dive into the video. Alrighty, y'all. I hope you'll forgive me, but I forgot to cover the recap of my Week 1 picks in the wide receivers episode, so I'm going to make sure I start with that very, very briefly here. It'll only take up 30 seconds to a minute of your time, but I want to let you guys know how my picks went for Week 1 action. So basically, my assessment is that I went 2 of 4 for the Week 1 games. I'm cutting the Elijah Mitchell pick because he got injured early in that contest. I actually had some bad luck this week. We had Chris Godwin get injured. We had Allen Lazard not even suit up because I made that video on Tuesday last week, and he didn't end up playing for the wide receivers portion. So the injury bug kind of stuffed our must-start players for Week 1, but we're looking for a bounce back here in Week 2. The hits that we had last week were Antonio Gibson and A.J. Dillon, and the misses were simply Josh Jacobs and Travis Etienne. But I will note, Travis Etienne, of all fantasy players in Week 1, had the most missing points of any fantasy player. Essentially what that means are plays that nearly resulted in big plays or touchdowns that were missed for whatever reason. Basically, in Etienne's scenario, what happened was Trevor Lawrence missed him wide open in the end zone for a touchdown reception. And on another play, on a separate drive, a separate series, Lawrence had a walk-in touchdown pass to Travis Etienne. It would have been a 5-yard score, and he flat out stone-handed it and dropped it. He just turned his head upfield too fast. Travis had gotten rocked in that game a couple of times, so I think he heard footsteps and left 2 touchdowns hanging on the table, which would have netted to 15.8 more fantasy points than he ended up scoring. So still feeling pretty good about that pick, but obviously didn't turn out in the actual scorebook, so that's what ends up, being the difference in what matters. So those missing points are something interesting to keep your eye on each week, though. So let's dive into our first must-start running back here for Week 1 action. We're talking some Kareem Hunt, a guy who just made my must-sells list for this week, but I love the matchup here. So if you got to hang on for another week, if you want to see this backfield situation play out for another week's worth of games, all the power to you. I like his situation here moving into not Detroit Lions, to New York Jets week here, where the Jets happen to find themselves as 6-point underdogs. So the Browns are 6-point favorites here at home. And that's obviously, starting out with here, something that positions the Browns to have a very favorable game script. Regardless if that's the situation or not, I am expecting a somewhat close football game. I am expecting and definitely not expecting the Jets to get out to a big lead in this game. So what does that mean? I essentially see the run game being a very, very viable form of moving the football for 4 entire quarters here for the Cleveland Browns. I'm expecting them to front run in this game, but even if they don't, they are such a run-centric offense right now because clearly Jacoby Brissett has limitations. Clearly they can't just back up and throw the football downfield and ultimately air things out for 4 quarters. That's just not going to work with the quarterback situation that they have currently. And we saw that in Week 1. This team leaned on Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt to a large extent, and both of those players put up very impressive stat lines. Nick Chubb didn't find the end zone, but he had some very efficient rushing, and Kareem Hunt had 15 total touches and converted all 4 of his passing game opportunities into receptions and scored 2 total touchdowns. So I'm expecting somewhat, similarities here for this upcoming week. I do think that there is some element of touchdown. I don't want to call it touchdown dependency, but ultimately Hunt's ceiling, if he's going to tap into that phase of things here, does need to be unlocked by a touchdown. But he is a very viable TD vulture from Nick Chubb. We saw Nick Chubb go scoreless on the goal line last week, and Hunt was the player they gave the nod to in that area of the field. So I would definitely consider this to be a situation where on a weekly basis, you expect about roughly a 50-50 split of those carries to go to Hunt and Chubb respectively. So I feel confident enough about his opportunity to get those types of valuable touches. And again, in this game where the Browns are 6-point favorites. The rushing phase will be very, very much a factor, and he should see a heavy volume of opportunities. Clearly, being the receiving back in this offense is a very valuable situation to have as well. So a couple final stats here before we move on to our next player. Hunt actually outsnapped Nick Chubb in week 1. He had a 56% snap share versus just 53% for Nick Chubb. So a slight differential in favor of Kareem Hunt here. But again, I am expecting things to be kind of cut and dry right down the middle, except for that receiving phase, which will head the direction of Hunt. So our next must-start running back here is A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers taking on the Chicago Bears on Sunday Night Football at home here. The Packers, much like the Cleveland Browns this week, I think it's a much more warranted favorite here, are 10-point favorites against the Chicago Bears. Again, it was the Browns that were 6-point favorites over the Jets. I think they both have shaky quarterback situations, so I'm not sure how I feel about that. You can also make the argument here, of course, that the Packers got stomped out last week. They shouldn't be 10-point favorites over the team that's actually ranked higher than them in terms of the divisional standings based off a 1-0 record versus an 0-1 record for the Packers. But I do love A.J. Dillon in this Packers offensive situation here as we move into week 2 for fantasy football, for A.J. Dillon's purposes. There's not too much else to like at this current point in time outside of maybe an Aaron Jones. If you're taking a streamer tight end on Robert Tonyan. But A.J. Dillon showed us last week being the most viable fantasy option that he needs to be a lineup play each and every single week. He played just 51% of the snaps. However, I will reference and note that Nick Chubb a season ago finished as the RB10 in fantasy points per game in a split with Kareem Hunt for much of the season. Hunt missed some time, but Nick Chubb was able to finish as a top 10 fantasy running back on a points per game basis with a 51% snap share. So he did have 10% fewer snaps than Aaron Jones in week 1. Aaron Jones played 61% of the snaps for Green Bay, but A.J. Dillon vastly outscored him because the touches he got when he was on the field were very, very frequent. This is a guy who had, I believe it was 15 total touches as well for A.J. Dillon last week, and a player who led the Packers in both the rushing and receiving phases of their offense. So not only did he out-target Aaron Jones, he out-touched him in rushing attempts. He got the goal line nod, obviously, for those very valuable 6-point plays there. And he showed us, obviously, we know he has the size to be a workhorse running back in this league. There will be some element of committee level distribution, but for how bare and thin that wide receiver room is in Green Bay, they're going to need to use these running backs at a high level every single week. And we did see Elijah Mitchell, prior to getting injured last week, average over 6 yards per carry against the Chicago front in a monsoon. So I think a very physical running back in A.J. Dillon can have another efficient game here. He averaged 4.5 yards per carry last week, and I expect that number to be between 4.5 and 5 yards per touch again here. Chalk in some of that receiving work as well. Maybe he gets another goal line carry or two. And what could be a blowout Packers win, give him a very favorable game script in the second half of this contest. Next up, let's head to LA where we're taking on the Los Angeles Rams, or at least Cordarrelle Patterson is. CPAT, after week 1, looks like the same old 2021 CPAT, a guy who broke out and emerged onto the scene as an elite level fantasy football running back, as weird as that sounds to say last year, was at one point the RB4 in fantasy football, and had himself a monster season, scoring touchdowns left and right, being incredibly dynamic in both the rushing and receiving phases, and he really took over that game. For the majority of the contest, the Falcons were leading the Saints for about 2.5 quarters of that contest, and they ended up falling just short, 27-26, but CPAT was a focal point and a priority for the Falcons to get the football to. And just 65% of their snap share, I shouldn't say just 65%, that's actually a very, very good snap share. He was able to get 22 rushes for $120 on the ground and average 4.45 yards per carry against a defense that has previously been, for numerous seasons, one of the better stout run-stuffing fronts in the NFL. So CPAT went out there and dominated, was insanely efficient on the ground, scored a rushing touchdown as well. He's a monster of a human being, so he's not an easy tackle in those goal line situations. And he added 5 targets for 3 receptions and 16 yards. That number is something we could see increase. Maybe he doesn't have nearly the same immense rushing value on the ground this week, but definitely someone who can line up out wide, go in the slot, and do some damage as a pass catcher for that offense. So I think the Falcons offense needs to continue using CPAT in this fashion. They went toe-to-toe with what I expect to be a very competitive Saints team this year in week 1. The Rams are still trying to rebound from that tough Thursday night outing, and Devin Singletary and some of those other running backs, Zach Moss included, had their way with this Rams front. They were able to out-physical the Rams up front and get some push, some movement, and those smaller backs were doing some damage. Efficiency-wise, they weren't necessarily the biggest fantasy scorers of the week, but if CPAT continues to get this level of work, we're talking 20-plus total touches with his athleticism and physicality in space, you could see another very, very impressive. I have him as a high-end RB2 this week for a guy who wasn't even a top 24 play for me coming into last week's games. Next up here, our 4th must-start running back is Miles Sanders here, taking on the Minnesota Vikings at home. The Eagles are 2.5-point favorites, so you're expecting a very even game script from both teams. You're expecting, kind of a close, not quite a pick-em game, but separated by just under a field goal. It's clearly a very competitive contest. Miles Sanders really impressed in week 1. I do happen to like this matchup again here for the Eagles in week 2. Another player I did have in my sell high list, but if you find yourself holding him for another week here, maybe you can compile those 2 nice games and 2 favorable matchups into some nice trade bait and value in return here. But what I see in Miles Sanders is a guy who averaged 7 yards per carry, actually over 7.3 yards per carry in week 1 on a 52% snap share. He had 96 yards on 13 carries and a rushing touchdown. The thing we kind of are scared of here is the fact that there was 4 rushing touchdowns from the Eagles. 4 different players scored those rushing touchdowns: Jalen Hurts, Boston Scott, Miles Sanders, and Kenneth Gainwell. But what I like about Miles here in week 2, knowing he's not a workhorse, I wanted to take those same 13 total carries and pace that out over the course of the contest. If you take A.J. Dillon's 4.5 yards per carry, a banged-up Packers offensive line got a very effective push despite having little to no offense for 4 quarters. They were able to efficiently run the football on this team when they had to in spurts. Again, A.J. Dillon averaged 4.5 yards per carry against this team, and Aaron Jones averaged over 9 yards per carry in his opportunities on the ground against this team. So imagine a better Philadelphia offensive line that has a really balanced attack right now. They're lethal in the run game. A.J. Brown was dominant in the pass game last week. They should be able to have a really balanced approach here and keep the Vikings on their toes defensively. If you pace out that game at 4.5 yards per carry at 13 touches on the ground, you're getting about 60 yards on the ground rushing. Add in any more efficiency that Miles Sanders can get. He is really, realistically, a lot more similar to Aaron Jones as a back than he is to A.J. Dillon, and Aaron Jones had almost twice as much efficiency in that first opening contest. So all things to consider here. The moral of the story, I don't think he'll quite average 7 yards per carry this week, but maybe it's 5.5 yards, maybe even gets up to 6 if he breaks off a long run here, which is something he's known for doing. And imagine if he gets another one of those goal line nods head to his direction, he could see some really, really nice play here in our lineups in week 2. So I've got him as an RB2 again here in week 2 action, but after that, I think it gets a little bit shaky for Miles Sanders moving forward. Darrell Henderson is my 5th and final must-start player here before we dive into him. If you guys are enjoying today's episode, it means a ton to me if you just smash that like button and, of course, support the channel here. Let me know your fantasy football questions down in the comment section below. I'm here to be an interactive resource and tool, so if you've got questions, don't be afraid, don't be shy. Let them fly down there, and I'll get back to as many of you as I possibly can. Also, check out some of the links in the description of today's video. We've got a ton of stuff from TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, a bunch of other platforms that we're on here. Of course, our website, sizzlefantasy.com. We're writing articles for week 2 fantasy football advice that you can access simply just by heading over there, checking out our articles gallery, and taking advantage of that stuff. So go check out all of that. It's located under the SFS Gold drop-down menu. And, of course, if you want some extra edge in your fantasy leagues this season, scan that QR code in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and that'll take you to our information page for that on that website. So Darrell Henderson's the final name I'm talking through here today, taking on the Atlanta Falcons. What you love about Darrell Henderson is an 82% snap share in week 1. What I'm not expecting to see is a total reverse of things in Sean McVay cutting Cam Akers loose here. He talked about wanting more urgency from Cam Akers in week 1. He talked about, there's a little bit left to be desired here. Maybe he's not totally healthy. Maybe he hasn't shown enough ambition at practice. Whatever the case might be, I'm totally chill with the way that they distributed this backfield, giving Darrell Henderson those touches to lead off the year. 82% snap share is phenomenal. You're talking about a really, really great, like those are workhorse level numbers in terms of opportunity for a running back to see the football field. Like I said, 65% for Cordarrelle Patterson are very, very good numbers. You're talking about guys who finished top 10 in fantasy points per game, like Nick Chubb, only being at a 51% marker. Now, that's an outlier and an anomaly because he's such a good running back and he's so efficient. But Darrell Henderson's a pretty complete player here. He's not flashy in any one element of his game, but he's reliable in the red zone. He's reliable in the receiving game. And Sean McVay gives him valuable touches. So for a guy who saw 13 rushes and 5 receptions in week 1, 18 total touches, I'm taking that. That is good quality production that you can depend on and rely on here on a week in, week out basis. Additionally, the Rams are 10.5-point favorites at home here against Atlanta. You're getting that game script bouncing in the direction of the Rams offensively. That means running out the clock and obviously playing smash mouth football up front. They need to establish a run game here. And again, they're looking to rebound here in week 2. They're looking to improve their offensive attack and prove that they are still a viable and competent defending Super Bowl champions. So one last note here. As I said, 82% of the snap share went to Darrell Henderson week 1. Cam Akers played just 18% of the snaps. 0 of those snaps came in the first quarter, and he had 0 fantasy points. So that's why we're confident in Darrell Henderson here moving into week 2. The matchup on paper isn't even that great. They did a very good job against Alvin Kamara, the Falcons, that being in week 1. He had, 3.5, 4.5 fantasy points in that game. But I do expect Darrell Henderson to do a bit better here and to see some very valuable touches for this team. So those are our 5 must-start running backs for week 2 action. If you enjoyed, again, make sure to smash that like button. It helps me out a ton here. And comment your questions. Check out the links in the description of today's video. Check out some of our other stuff. We've got a playlist for week 2 fantasy football advice filled with different information for different style episodes, and a ton of that stuff is already up on the channel for this week. So check all that stuff out and more from Sizzle Fantasy Sports here. I appreciate your guys' time, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.